Welcome back, everyone, to this episode of Popcorn Diaries. Well, it's October 31st. It's Halloween. This is episode 13, where we are going to focus on our favorite monsters of all time. Up until this point, we reviewed 12 movies that represented what we think is probably the best horror movies out there. But today, we're going to talk about monsters. So let's get started. Adriana, let's go ahead and start with your favorite monster.
Well, my favorite monster hasn't changed since I was like 12, and it's always been Dracula. I've always been a vampire fan.
Good choice.
How about yourself?
I'm going to have to go with Frankenstein.
Frankenstein is also a very, very good character.
Although it's not Frankenstein, it's Frankenstein's monster, to be totally correct.
Correct. Everybody out there thinks that Frankenstein's monster is actually called Frankenstein, but we don't know what his name is.
That's correct. He never had a name throughout the movies. He was always referred to as the monster, the thing, the whatever. But it was actually the scientist, Victor Frankenstein, or Frankenstein, as you might say. And it was his monster that was created. But everyone does refer to the monster as Frankenstein.
Seeing as you like Frankenstein, did you actually read the Mary Shelley books?
I'm embarrassed to say that I have not read the book. But of all the Frankenstein movies that were made, and there are over 130 movies that were inspired by the Frankenstein monster character, my favorite still remains one of the very early ones, and that is the 1931 edition starring Boris Karloff.
1931 was a very good year because it is also the year that Dracula started his series and debut on film.
Absolutely. And that's so what makes Dracula so appealing to you?
Well, let's see. Immortality, charming character, dominion over elements, animals, and sometimes even people.
Yeah, he had a nice place, too.
Well, wouldn't you want to be a vampire for? I mean, the only downside is being, an evil hellspawn, but I could live with that.
Yeah, he didn't have much of a day life, right? He was pretty much a night.
I could live without the sun. I'm more of a moon child. How about yourself? What appeals to you about Frankenstein?
Well, obviously the story is just absolutely riveting. This thing was written back in the early 1800s, and when it was first published, it didn't even have Mary Shelley's name on it. It was published anonymously, if you will, and it wasn't until like 1823 that her name was actually pinned on it. But it's just the story itself. Some mad doctor taking dead body parts and trying to reanimate it for immortality, if you will. It kind of strikes home because you kind of hear about some of that stuff maybe even happening in this day and age with stem cell research and so on and so forth. So it's kind of creepy to me.
You see a lot of horror films using science as a way to prolong life.
Mm-hmm.
It's either science or there's a curse involved.
Yeah.
Like, for example, with Dracula, it's usually a curse or some possession, a deal with the devil. But it's always about prolonging life. We're very into that when it comes to horror movies.
And back then, they did such a great job. These are black and white pictures. They use great camera angles, great imagery. From the opening moments of either of the movies, you're in Creepsville.
Yes, you are.
And they take such advantage of that black and white medium, if you will. Some of the best scenes in Frankenstein are when they're down in the laboratory and you've got the sparks flying and the machines going and, the mad doctor, give me life, that kind of stuff. Man, that stuff is just, absolutely great movie making.
We're so used to seeing color films full of visual effects, full of mayhem and CG. And you know what? They're great. They do emphasize a lot of the horror elements. But when you take a look at films like the original Dracula and the original Frankenstein, you see the work that went into it, how they had to innovate and find a way to make it look creepy. They had to bring you into that frame of mind. Either they did it or they lost the audience. And these are films that have stood up the test of time.
Oh, absolutely. And they're very physical films because, again, there was no CGI and other special effects to use. Everything you see there, they were doing.
Yeah.
And you're right. These movies have really stood the test of time. They're totally watchable even today.
Yeah.
And they still give me the creeps watching it. Because the acting is so good, the directing is so good.
Yeah. Who doesn't appreciate Bela Lugosi as Dracula coming in, trying to cover half his face,
with the cape.
Yeah, and that voice that he accentuates for Dracula.
Yeah, come here, my boy, yes.
One of the things I found really interesting was the way that they emphasized his eyes and gave him that evil glare was actually using two pen lights.
Oh, that's right, from off-site, and they were like reflecting it
so
against his eyes.
So they reflected him into his eyes, so that way he would have the evil stare. Whereas today, you would kind of go in there and do it with a computer. Back then, they had to find, a way to get around it, to make him look more menacing, and they certainly pulled it off.
Oh, they did. And I think in both these films and of horror films of this era, they did so much with lighting and shadowing. They really made everything look creepy.
Yeah, they did.
And you never really get comfortable. You're always kind of off balance, whatever scene you're in.
I mean, one of the great things about these early films is that they are in black and white because the light plays such an important role in it.
Yes, it does.
You've got these really heavy shadows, these beautiful grays and, almost silver tones, and they just look amazing when you watch them. And now that some of them have been remastered, they look 10 times better.
Yeah, they have done a great job of bringing these back out, remastering, cleaning them up, of course, and throwing them on Blu-ray and that type of thing. They've looked never better, in my opinion. But unfortunately, both these films and both these characters, in my opinion, have suffered over time with the remakes.
Yeah, as you said, Frankenstein has been in over 130-something movies, and Dracula has been in over 280-something movies. But there have been good ones and there have been bad ones. So let's talk about the good ones. Which ones are your favorite Frankenstein?
Honestly, I would have to go with of that same era, if you will, into the 40s. There was Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, the Ghost of Frankenstein. Those were still pretty good because they starred people like Lon Chaney and Bela Lugosi and that type of thing. And those were classic characters of the day. But after that, I'll be honest with you, the whole Frankenstein thing falls apart for me all the way through up present day. And then there was that one version of Frankenstein with Robert De Niro. Oh my, what were they thinking? I mean, did he need the money that bad? It's absolutely horrid.
Yeah, he doesn't do a good job of being a monster. But then again, it's not a role he's generally used to. You do not see him playing these roles. He can be menacing. He can be threatening. He can be the, epitome of a gangster. But playing Frankenstein is not a role he was, meant for.
It definitely didn't work. And I got to honestly say, the only other Frankenstein movie that just kills me, and that's way past the 1940s, of course, is Young Frankenstein, Mel Brooks, a parody, a comedy. To me, that thing is just absolutely hilarious. And I love what Mel did with it because he did step back to the black and white days, because it is shot in black and white. So he did play with the lighting and the shadowing and that type of thing. And if you pay real close attention, when they're down in the lab trying to animate the monster and get him going, a lot of those props down there are from the 1931 original film. Okay, so good and bad with Dracula. What's your best?
Well, there are, like I said, over 280-something movies with Dracula in it. Some of my favorites would have to be, of course, the original, 1931 with Bela Lugosi. You just can't beat that. Then there was the 1992 Francis Ford Coppola edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Oh, that one is good.
With Gary Oldman, Keanu Reeves, Winona Ryder, and many others. That was also among one of my favorites. I think they did a pretty decent job in that movie of portraying what the book was actually about. Yeah. So that was fairly accurate to the book. I mean, they had to obviously edit out some parts. And then, surprisingly, this year's rendition of Dracula Untold has become one of my new favorites.
Okay, that one I have not seen yet.
Yeah, it just came out last week, and I must say I was pleasantly surprised to see that this movie took a serious note, was not cheesy at all, and it gives a good backstory to what Dracula could have been about. So I was kind of really happy to see that they did a good job with this film, although there is always the bad. There is always the flip side. Yeah,
they've butchered a lot of them in the past.
Yeah, they have. Some of my least favorites have to include Dracula 2000. That was just horrible, 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 horrible acting, just cheesy, over-the-top comedy sometimes. And then all the mashups. I really will never understand what the monsters versus certain other monsters, or, for example, Bonnie and Clyde versus Dracula. Where do these people come up with that? Then you've got Dracula versus the Ninja Moon. Just horrible movies with really no plot line, no storyline, just somebody went out there with some money and made a movie. So those are pretty much the ones that I try to stay away from, or especially the mashup. So in your opinion, who was the best actor that played Frankenstein?
No doubt about it, it was Boris Karloff. Even with all the 130-plus movies that have been made, he's by far the best. And for Dracula?
For Dracula, for me, it has to be Gary Oldman.
Okay, so out of all the movies, do you have a favorite scene?
That's a tough one. I think one of my favorite scenes happens to be when Keanu Reeves is shaving
Okay.
in Bram Stoker's Dracula. And he comes in and he takes the knife and he just swipes it across his tongue. I just thought that scene was so creepy. I mean, everything around them was completely in darkness. So you just had this like spotlight on both Keanu Reeves and Gary Oldman, and everything else was kind of really dark. So it really got me into that moment in time. How about yourself?
I'm going to step back to the scene where the Frankenstein monster meets little Maria by the pond. Yeah, and as we all know, little Maria ends up in the pond.
Yes, she does.
So that is a great scene, and that scene's been mimicked many, many times in many of the movies. Yeah.
So let's talk about some trivia points of all the Dracula movies, or things that have happened along the years. So what do you got for me?
Just a couple things that are pretty interesting. The reason they use the name Frankenstein is because there was this guy named Conrad Dippel back in the 18th century, early 18th century, that was in Castle Frankenstein. So that's where the Frankenstein name comes. And yes, this guy was actually experimenting with body parts to see if he could reanimate them. That's a true fact. Yeah,
Creepy.
That's pretty creepy. A couple other things that are very, very interesting. There's been 2 U.S. postage stamps with Frankenstein on it in 1997 and 2002, which
I bet both are collector's items.
I never knew that. And just to finish it off, this was Boris Karloff's first major role. This put him on the map, so to speak, and he was personally selected by the director James Whale.
Wow, those are some pretty good trivia points I didn't even know myself. As far as Dracula, I've got a few. Bela Lugosi was actually buried in the silk cape that he used in Dracula.
Way.
Yes,
I did not know that. Okay, that's creepy.
Kind of creepy. But I guess he loved the character so much that he decided to be buried with the silk cape. Richard Matheson, who wrote one of my favorite books, I Am Legend, actually was inspired by the original 1931 film. He said, and I quote, "Viewing Dracula, my mind drifted off and I thought, if one vampire is scary, what if the whole world is full of vampires?"
Oh, yeah.
And that is how I Am Legend came about. So that I thought was amazing.
Oh, very cool.
And one thing with Gary Oldman that I really, really thought was funny and creepy, is in the 1992 movie. There's a scene where they burst in on him when he's with Mina, and he turns into this bat-looking thing.
Yeah.
And so he was really uncomfortable in the makeup, and he wanted to just get out, and he didn't feel like he was playing it off scary enough. So Francis Ford Coppola says to him, well, whisper something creepy in the actor's ears before we start the scene. And he went up to each of the actors involved in the scene and whispered something in their ear. And those reactions are what you see on film.
Oh, now do we know what
he creeped them out? No, nobody knows what he said.
Oh, yeah.
I wish I knew, but
very,
Gary's
very cool.
out there, so who knows what he said.
Yeah.
And lastly, with the 1992 edition, when it was previewed to audiences, the audiences thought that it was too bloody and gory, so they actually cut out 25 minutes of the film.
Oh, that's just funny by today's standards.
By today's standards, we'd probably be looking at more buckets of blood. So I wonder if they're ever going to release a full version, or if there is one out there. If there is, let me know. I'd like to see it.
Be like the director's cut or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine that would surface in time because, boy, these days everybody likes that.
Oh, yeah. There's always a way to make extra money in Hollywood. So that's going to wrap it up for us today. This is day 13 of 13 Days of Halloween on Halloween Eve. So hopefully you all are out there having fun, being scared, pretending to be your favorite monster, and we'll see you next time on Popcorn Diaries.